take you through the training. Thanks very much, Stevie.
Thanks, Ruth. Give me a thumbs up there if you can hear me. Okay, so I'm assuming everyone can hear me. So I'm going to take you through some slides now for the next 35-40 minutes. And then my colleague Mel is going to take you through a short story about electricity and its origins at the end of this presentation. So my name's Stevie Donnelly. I'm from IT Sligo, and we are mentors for the Border and West region as part of the SEC Sustainable Energy Communities programme with SEAI. And today I'm going to talk about renewable electricity. Okay. So why have SEAI put on these different webinars? So as part of being a member of the SEC network, communities, SEAI have identified 7 core competencies. As you can see there on the right hand side, the different competencies are integrated planning, partnerships and engagement, or what we call community engagement or energy champion, strategic financing, and then moving into the blue ones at the bottom, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, renewable energy, and smart energy, or smart grid is what we sometimes call it. So these are the key sort of competencies for a community to develop a successful project, any type of energy project. And as I said, we're talking about renewable electricity today. Renewable electricity is part of renewable energy. So we have split it into two, into renewable electricity and renewable heat. And we're going to give a webinar on renewable heat tomorrow. But today we're going to focus on renewable electricity again, because there's so much in renewable energy. We've decided to split it into two. So when we talk about renewable electricity, in general terms, we're talking about solar photovoltaic, wind energy, hydro, and then ocean and wave and tidal. And again, if you want to join the webinar tomorrow, it will be on renewable heat, and we're going to talk about solar thermal, biomass, biogas, and heat pumps, and a little bit about district heating also. So we'll plough on now with renewable electricity. So when we're talking about renewable energy in the community, in broad terms, this is what it might look like in a small village in Ireland. You can see there at the bottom right of the picture, your community might look to install some solar PV panels to generate electricity, and it can work very well in petrol stations and 7-day shops and cafes. Then some of the homes in the village might look at installing solar thermal for their domestic hot water requirement. The local hotel or large B&B might look at a biomass boiler, and then the local farm might be a location for a biogas plant, and that biogas plant could then in fact produce gas for heat, which could be fed into a number of homes in what we show here is a small district heating scheme. And district heating just means that you can use one boiler instead of 10 separate boilers for each home. And then again, another set of houses might decide to install some heat pumps, but obviously they would have to ensure that their home is of a sufficient energy rating and air tightness, so they might have to have some external insulation or roof insulation to make the heat pumps viable. So as the community develops these different projects, small scale projects, they might then look towards something larger, like a community-owned wind farm. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that through the new Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. And then just to give an example, again, not all communities are inland, some are on the coast. So just to give an idea, there's been a lot of discussion now in the news about offshore wind farms being the next big part of renewable electricity generation in Ireland. And then obviously there's the potential for wave generators and also tidal generators. So I'll talk a little bit more about them. They're not fully mature technologies, so I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the presentation. So just a little bit about targets and policy and why we're doing what we're doing. So this is on the left hand side there is the blue graphic that SEAI have produced in the last number of weeks, about a month ago. And it's data up until the end of 2018, and it gives us our standings in our renewable energy targets up to 2020. Okay, so you can see there in the white bar, our overall renewable energy target for 2020 is 16%. Okay, and we've achieved to date, or to the end of 2018, 11% of that 16% target. This overall renewable energy target includes sub-targets for transport, for heat, and also for electricity. So you can see transport in blue. Our target for 2020 was to have 10% of transport energy to come from renewable sources, and we've achieved 7.2% of that, again, up to the end of 2018. For heat, we have a target of 12% of heat to come from renewable sources by 2020, and again, up to the end of 2018, we'd achieved 6.5% of that, so we haven't done too well in that. And then the one that we have done okay in is the 40% 2020 target, and up to the end of 2018 we've achieved over 33% in that. So it's by and large the success story, if you want to call it that, about how Ireland is tackling its renewable energy obligations. Obviously we're not on track, so hopefully now, as you look at the right hand side of the page, this is Richard Bruton's Climate Action Plan, which was released last year, and it sets some fairly ambitious targets. Again, it's probably going to be there's going to be more discussion about targets within that as the new government forms. But just to give some of the high level targets that are in that in relation to renewable electricity. So the Climate Action Plan is looking to increase the target to 70% renewable electricity by 2020. So you'll see that our target for 2020 was 16%, and now we're talking about a target of 70% renewable electricity by 2030. So that is a huge increase, and shows a good level of ambition. And then we have the support scheme for microgeneration, which is basically if you decide to install solar PV panels on your roof to generate electricity, that whatever you're not able to use in your own home, that you'll be able to sell that back to the grid for a certain fee. So that scheme is under discussion at the moment. And then finally, the RES, as they call it, the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. And there's a lot of, it's a new framework now about how communities can now become involved, if not drive their own renewable generation projects in their own localities. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. So the RES basically marks a shift from a guaranteed fixed price for renewable generators that we would have seen through the refit scheme. The refit scheme is the Renewable Electricity Feed-in Tariff. And that scheme, although it will operate for whoever signed up to it for the next 15 years, it has in fact come to an end now for new applicants, and the new applicants will have to go for this new RES scheme. So the refit, when you see the PSO levy on your electricity bill, that's basically what you're paying for. You're paying for a lot of the renewable energy in Ireland, including some of the money goes towards peat and other security of supply issues as well. So we had in the refit a guaranteed fixed price for renewable generators. The new RES framework is going to be a more market-oriented mechanism in the form of auctions. So the cost of the renewable electricity generation will be determined by competitive bidding between renewable generators. Okay, and one of the key parts then, and again for the Sustainable Energy Community Network to be aware of, it is an enabling framework for community participation. So pre-qualification for the auction means that any renewable energy project at large scale will have to have an offering to the community for an opportunity to invest in or own a proportion of renewable energy projects, as well as providing a community benefit fund for wherever that renewable project is located. So, and importantly, there is a role here that hasn't been fully fleshed out, but it's described as trusted intermediary and trusted advisors. So these are people that can help take your community through maybe a feasibility study for a renewable energy project in your community, and help you with some of the technical detail and different roles like that. So this is in fact a role that potentially your SEC could play in that community. So we have yet to hear a little bit more about the detail of that, but it will be on the way. And just to give you an idea of the timelines then of the first Renewable Electricity Support Scheme auction. So there was a qualification application back in April 2020. Timelines were pushed out a little bit because of COVID-19. There's going to be those renewable energy generators are going to be able to submit into an auction in July 2020, and then they'll be awarded in September 2020. Again, those timelines might be pushed out a little bit, but it'll just give you an idea of what's coming down the track. It'll be very interesting to see in particular the community elements of the new res and what's going to happen towards the end of the year. So that's just a little bit about the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, something very important for communities to now be aware of, because it is a way for communities to now get involved in large-scale renewable energy generation. So before I go into each of the different types of renewable electricity, just a little bit about energy basics. So we talk about the conservation of energy, in that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can actually only be transformed or transferred from one form to another. And whenever we do that, whenever we transform it or transfer it, we lose some of the energy from the system. So it's not destroyed, it's lost. And here's an example here of a typical oil or gas boiler. You have your oil coming in from your tank in your garden, or you have your gas coming in through a pipe. And that is in fact 100% chemical energy, and there's 100% energy within that oil or gas. We bring the oil or gas into the boiler, and we use the combustion chamber to combust that fuel, and we lose some of the energy then as it's transformed from chemical energy into heat energy. And in this example, we're losing about 10% of that energy. As that heat energy is transferred into the water system, your radiators in your home, again, you lose a little bit of that heat through that transfer to the water. So again, your oil or gas boiler might in fact only be 80% efficient. And again, just to give an example in terms of electricity generation, this is an example for a wind turbine. So obviously you have on the left-hand side, you have the kinetic energy of the wind, and theoretically there's 100% energy in the wind. As it passes through the wind turbine, there's usually only 3 blades that can capture that energy, and we have some aerodynamic losses there. So you straight away go from 100% energy in the wind to 55% collected by the wind turbine. The wind turbine then has to take that energy into the generator of the wind turbine, and again there's some losses there, mechanical losses. And again, from those mechanical workings of the wind turbine, you have to provide electricity to the grid in a usable form. You can't just spill it onto the grid. It has to be suitable for intake by the grid. And again, once it gets to that stage, you only in fact have about 40% of the energy left from that potential 100%. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the efficiency of energy generation. When we talk about energy units and quantities, these terms are often mixed up sometimes. We have work, energy and power. So work is the provision of heat or light or motion, and then energy, we need energy in order to do work, and we measure energy in kilowatt hours and megawatt hours, and watts as well. And then power is the rate at which work is done, which is energy over time. And if we're talking about the power rating of something, we're talking about a 60-watt bulb or a 500 kilowatt electrical generator. So we talk about watts, kilowatts and megawatts for power. And just to give some of the typical household energy consumption figures, a typical house in Ireland will use approximately 11,000 kilowatt hours of thermal energy, so heat energy, and then it will use about just over 4,000 kilowatt hours of electrical energy. And this is just a breakdown of how it's used, again, how the energy in your household is used. And then just some of the prices you'll see there. Obviously, the electricity per kilowatt hour in a domestic setting is 17 cents per kilowatt hour, and you can see then that oil and natural gas is hovering in around 6 or 7 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can see that the majority of energy used in our homes is for heat, but on average we spend roughly in and around the same amount cost-wise in heating our homes as we do in electricity. So it's interesting to note that. Okay, so we'll talk about solar energy. So generally with solar energy, we talk about solar PV or solar photovoltaics, which generate electricity. And then you might see the other ones on the right-hand side of the picture here, solar thermal, which provides hot water. And I'll talk about solar thermal tomorrow in the webinar tomorrow, but now I'm going to talk about solar electricity. So when we talk about solar energy, we're talking about how much of the sun's energy is landing on 1 metre squared of Ireland at any one time. So approximately 1,000 kilowatt hours falls in every 1 metre squared in Ireland, and it's our ability to capture that energy into a useful form that's really key. This table just shows, depending which way your solar panels or the roof of your house is facing, the ideal scenarios for how you should install solar PV panels. So ideally they should be installed, I've highlighted in orange here, at a 30 to 45 degree angle, which most roofs will be in and around that angle. And obviously you want it to be south facing. You can see there on the right hand side of the table, the north facing, the last column. Even if it's the right inclination, you're only going to get 500 or 600 kilowatt hours of energy, and it's not really enough to make a solar PV installation viable. So you're looking for that south facing 30 to 45 degree angle. Southeast, southwest is fine as well. And then just some of the considerations. Solar energy is intermittent, but it is predictable. It can be used to supply your hot water in the summertime, and it suits a high summer electrical demand, which many buildings will have through cooling or refrigeration processes. It doesn't really suit space heating because of the amount of thermal energy required for that. Doesn't suit schools because schools obviously are on summer break and they're on even a longer break now. But again, there's potential there through possibly the microgeneration scheme when and as it gets developed, that schools could find an alternative source of income through installing solar PV on their roof and then supplying that to the grid and generating income. So just to give an example then of solar PV electricity, it is generally made of semiconductor material, silicon, and it converts light into electricity, and it's about 15 to 20% efficient depending on where the panels are or the type of panels that are manufactured. It can either be installed on roofs or in fact on the ground, and you also need inverters to change the direct current electricity, which is how it's produced, into alternative current energy, which is what the grid wants and what your house wants. So just the capital costs, a small system might cost about 1,500 to 2,000 euro per kilowatt peak, and a larger scale system might cost 1,000 per kilowatt peak, for obvious reasons, for economies of scale in that. It has low operation and maintenance costs, and at the moment SEAI are giving out a grant of 3,000 euro for domestic solar PV systems that include a 4 kilowatt peak system, and it includes a battery as well. And then through the Sustainable Energy Communities Energy Grant Programme, there's potential for between 30 and 50% for a non-domestic setting. Okay. Again, when you're considering solar PV electricity, you might want to consider some energy efficiency measures first. This is just some of the terminology around PV panels, the cells, the modules, the panels, and then the arrays. So you can look at that in your own time. I won't dwell on it. And then just in general terms, your average solar module or panel measures about 1.6 meters squared, and in that 1.6 meters squared, it has the ability on a very nice fine summer day to produce between 250 watts or 350 watts of electricity, should the conditions be good or perfect. And here's an example. If you're conscious that some people are already on the SEC network, some are considering joining and some aren't on it at all, they might be just interested in looking at this presentation. But if you are a sustainable energy community or thinking about it, obviously you're looking at potentially carrying out an energy master plan for your community. And within that energy master plan, you can get your energy consultant to identify the best sites in your community for solar energy. And just to go through the points there, so you can identify and rank the best potential sites and buildings, such as 7-day businesses, places that have a summer demand, shops, hotels, nursing homes, even swimming pools. And then that consultant can look at a basic solar PV specification, commercial estimation. And again, if that's suitable and it comes across as a viable investment, you can then talk to those building owners and see if they want to participate in the SEC. And this is how you start to form a community project. And that's just an example of how you're linking up some of the different competencies that we talked about at the start. Okay, so wind energy. Okay, so just some of the terminology around wind turbines. You can see the turbine on the left there is a relatively small wind turbine. It's a Kingspan KW6 or 6 kilowatt power rated turbine with a rotor height of just under 6 meters and a hub height of between 9 and 20 meters. So you can see that's kind of small scale ones. You have to be careful with those, whether they're viable investments. You really have to do the calculations on them to see if they're going to be suitable for whatever setting you might be thinking about putting them in. Then the right hand side, you have the sort of more commercial sized wind turbines between 5 kilowatts and up to 3 megawatts. There are now some offshore wind turbines capable of producing up to 8 megawatts of power. That's one turbine on its own, which is really incredible how far the technology has come in the last 25 to 30 years. And some of the turbines, the ones pictured here, are Vestas V90 3 megawatt turbines. So there'd be a lot of these dotted around Ireland at the moment. It's going to be exciting now to see what happens when we talk about the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, and offshore wind turbines are going to be bigger and producing more power. So how does the energy come from the wind into the turbine and then get generated and then onto the grid? So the wind turbine, in general terms, can only start producing electricity when the wind speed is up to 4 meters per second. Okay, so I'm just looking at the graph now on the right hand side, and as the wind speed increases from 4, 5, 6 up to 10 up to 15, it's the wind turbine is producing more and more electricity up to the point where it reaches 14 meters per second, and that's in this case, this turbine, its maximum capacity is to be able to produce 850 kilowatts of power. Obviously the wind speed can increase up to 15, 20, 25 meters per second. The turbine will in fact still only produce 850 kilowatts between the wind speeds of 14 and 25, and I think after 25 meters squared it's too dangerous. There's too much load and torsion happening on the turbine, so they will in fact turn that turbine out of the wind as best they can, and it becomes unusable then. So it's just to give you an idea that at different wind speeds, different power is produced. And capacity or load factor is often talked about. So again, in the example at the start, we talked about the theoretical amount of power that's available in the wind, but in fact, how much of that are we capturing at any one time? So theoretically, an 850 kilowatt turbine operating at 365 days a year at 24 hours a day can technically or theoretically provide 7 million kilowatt hours per annum, again, if there was perfect conditions. But in fact, the actual output is about 30% of that. And we call that the capacity factor. And this is generally the figures for most wind farms, about 32% capacity factor. Some of the capital costs then, if you think about it per megawatt hour, so it can be up to 1.5 million per megawatt hour. Again, it depends on a lot of different factors. And within that, you're going to have an operation and maintenance cost of 1.4 cents per kilowatt hour. So you have to balance that against the cost of what you might be getting through the new Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. So within the refit, the Renewable Energy Feed-in Tariff, which is now closed but is obviously still operating for whoever signed up to it in time, you can see there large wind over 5 megawatts will get 7 cents per kilowatt hour of energy produced. And again, this is just some activity that you can do if you're looking at doing an energy master plan and your community might be interested in the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme and wind energy. You might be able to take this into consideration, and again, it's an example of using the competencies for a renewable energy project or a community energy project. Okay, so then offshore wind turbines, just a little bit about this. So obviously, it's no secret Ireland is one of the best resources in Europe for harnessing offshore wind. And again, the east coast of Ireland has sufficiently shallow water depths to allow for fixed foundation turbines. And then obviously some floating structures are coming into play now. There's some operating in Denmark, so it remains to be seen how well that they can cope with the extremities of the sea. So in the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan, Ireland has the potential to produce up to, or have 4.5 gigawatt hours, so that's 4,500 megawatt hours, so 4.5 gigawatt hours of installed capacity offshore by 2030. So that's the potential, and that's enough to power about 4.5 million homes per annum. So there aren't even 4.5 million homes in Ireland, but it's just to put it into context to say that's how much power is out there we should and would be able to export that to Europe in the future as well. And just an example of some of the developments currently ongoing, the SSE Renewables Arklow Wind Bank has 7 turbines. So that's offshore and has a capacity of 25 megawatts. So it's actually the only offshore wind farm in Ireland. And obviously that can be increased up to 200 turbines and produce a total of 525 megawatts in total. So that is a really, really large wind turbine. Just the last 3 there are just other examples of different offshore wind that are in the pipeline at the moment. And there's been renewed interest in them through the new Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. Okay, so hydro energy. On the left-hand side there is Ardna Crusha, which I think was built in 1924, 1927, and it met a very significant proportion of the electrical requirement of Ireland at the time. So just a bit about the basics of how hydro energy works. So basically the picture on the right here with the catchment area, the intake, the head pond, the weir, the buried penstock, the turbine house, the tail race, and then right down to your transmission. So obviously you have rainfall in your catchment area, which is maybe up high in some mountains. Rainfall in the catchment area feeds into a river. So the hydro intake at a high level draws water off the river or lake that has been formed. And then the weir or the penstock delivers that water to the turbine house at a lower level. And then the water drives the turbine, and that's how we generate electricity. And then obviously you're exporting that generated electricity to the grid. Okay. It's just an example of the different types of turbines that are used depending on the type of river or dam you might have. You can see there, depending on the head height that the water is stored at or coming from, right down to where the turbine is actually located. There are different types of turbines used depending on the head height and also the flow rate. Okay, so there's different things to be considered there. And again, what are we talking about when we talk about the head height, the hydraulic head? It's the vertical distance that the water falls through in generating power. Okay, the effective head takes account of losses in the penstock or weir, for example, such as bends or screens. And obviously, any hydro power station is very much reliant on the flow of water. This is the amount or volume of water passing up any point at a given time. There's some very useful information out there through the EPA and our hydrometric stations, if your community is considering it. It's at the moment thought that the majority of potential for large-scale hydro projects has been already developed in Ireland. But there may in fact be some suitable sites for smaller scale communities or small towns and villages in Ireland. So again, depending on the time of year, your hydro plant will produce a lot. Obviously, if it's raining a lot, more water, more flow, more energy, more electricity produced. So when you're designing these things, you have to consider everything. What's the water flow going to be in that river in general across a number of years? And again, we talk about the load factor. What's the potential for a 50 kilowatt hydro turbine to produce 50 kilowatts multiplied by 365 days per year by 24 hours, potential to produce over 400,000 kilowatt hours of energy per annum. But the actual output is more likely going to be something like 200,000 per kilowatt hour. So we talk about hydro energy having a load factor of about 45%. Okay, so just some basic average examples we're given here. And again, there's some activity that your SEC might look into if they are in fact interested in hydro. And again, just an example of linking the different core competencies in developing a specific community renewable energy project. Okay, so just going to talk a little bit about ocean energy. When we talk about ocean energy, we talk about wave and tidal. On the left is a wave energy generator currently being tested. The name of that company actually escapes me. On the right hand side is a tidal energy turbine. You can see there the EDF logos painted on it. They were a French company. They're in fact an English company now, and they had a lot of dealings with a company called Open Hydro in Ireland, which were based in Louth, who were looking very good for a while there, but unfortunately they've closed. These are very significant investment research projects that have been ongoing for years, so it still remains to see a viable one coming out of Ireland or being capable of being used in Ireland. So just to talk about what is wave energy, it might seem obvious, but it's based on waves are formed by winds blowing over the surface of the sea, and the resultant kinetic energy can be harnessed by wave energy devices. And obviously the best wave resources occur in areas where strong winds have travelled over long distances, such as Western European coasts. And again, a report that I mentioned previously for the offshore wind power, that same report highlighted that there's a theoretical wave energy resource of 525 terawatt hours of energy. So for comparison, the total electricity requirement for the Republic of Ireland is about 30 terawatt hours. Okay, so there's the potential to produce up to 17 times Ireland's entire electricity demand in the sea. So in realising Ireland's wave energy resource, it's going to depend on a number of key factors. So obviously the cost effectiveness of the technology. Whenever you hear about a wave or tidal research company collapsing, it's generally down to they haven't been able to provide a cost effective technology to go to market. So realising the potential again depends on the amount of power which can be connected to Ireland's electricity grid, especially on the western seaboard locations where the grid could be in better condition to take on these large-scale renewable energy projects. And obviously, if you've too much intermittent energy on the system, you've a worry, and EirGrid especially have a worry about how do you balance all that intermittent generation if you've lots of onshore, offshore wind turbines already, and then you throw wave energy into the mix. How do you balance all that to make sure that everyone gets the electricity they need at any one time? And again, very importantly, the impacts on the environment. You can't just go throwing a lot of large metal objects into the sea without understanding what impact they're going to have on marine life. This is just an example of some of these types of technologies being looked at the moment. Some have failed. Other companies might come back to them and reinvestigate them. I'll let you look at that in your own time. It's just giving an idea of the different novel ways, I suppose, that different companies have looked into different types of wave energy converters. And then just a bit about tidal energy, which is different from wave energy. So tidal streams are created by constantly changing gravitational pull of the moon and the sun and the world's oceans. Okay, so the tide never stops. Water moves one way first and then moves the other way, which means it can be accurately predicted on a daily basis or throughout the year. Again, they're using the kinetic energy of the energy of those flowing currents. So tidal stream resources are generally largest in areas where a good tidal range exists. And so where would these be? It would be in narrow straits or inlets, around headlands, and in and around channels between islands. Okay. And again, that report, the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan, it identified the potential to develop tidal energy in a number of areas around Ireland's coastline, including the southeast coast, the Shannon Estuary, and the northwest coast of Ireland, and with the potential to produce 3,000 megawatts. And again, just an example of some of the technologies that are being tried at the moment. That first one on the top left there is in fact the CGen, it was called, and it was in place in Northern Ireland. I think it was a 2 megawatt wind or tidal turbine, and it's been decommissioned now. So you can see that even when you get these things installed for testing, they may not work out eventually. I think it was in place though for about 10 years. So hopefully it will lead on to the technology becoming more refined. And you can see the different examples there of the technologies being tested at the moment. Okay, so that's it from me. I am now going to hand over to my colleague Mel, and he's going to talk about, is it the origins of electricity, Mel, from an Irish point of view? You're on mute there, Mel. I can hear you now. I'm going to go on mute.
Mel is on mute. Mel is
Still
on
on.
mute.
He's just taking himself off. There he is.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, you've got, yeah, you haven't put it to full presentation. We can see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Perfect. There it is now.
Okay. So, yeah, it's just a little break from some of the technical elements that Stevie would have been discussing. But try and bear in mind the questions you had, and don't try not to forget them in this intro. So this is a short story just around the vocabulary we use, around the words we use about electricity and electrons and electronics. And it starts with an Irish link. So this is an Irish physicist, George Johnson Stoney. He was born in Dunleary, 1826. He died in London in 1911, I think. So he was a pioneer, one of the pioneers studying electricity, and he is credited with coming up with the term electron. He was a great champion of the metric system, so that prompted him to come up with the idea of a standard unit of electricity. Now, while electron isn't a unit of electricity, he did describe it as a fundamental unit. He meant a fundamental particle of electricity. So he described it as this most remarkable fundamental unit of electricity. Now, we don't know exactly why he chose the term electron. They're obviously already using the term electricity, so those things are definitely related. Now, we go from George Stoney to J.J. Thomson. So when George Stoney published his article referring to the electron hadn't actually been discovered. He was just proposing its existence. About 6 years later, J.J. Thomson discovered the electron, and this was the discovery of the first subatomic particle ever. J.J. Thomson was working with cathode rays, and he concluded they were composed of these very light, negatively charged particles that he called corpuscles. But the scientific community preferred George Stoney's term and stuck with electrons, thankfully enough, because it's easier to say. Now, it may seem strange that the first subatomic particle to be discovered is referred to as negative, and that relates to another pioneer, Benjamin Franklin, who basically made a heads or tails decision when he was working with static electricity, and he made the wrong decision, and that's why we refer to them as negative. And that brings me to some of those early pioneers who would very often have spent their time studying static electricity, which is related to electricity. And they'd work with those materials we're all aware of. We all grew up playing with balloons, just like the kid in the slide here. And you'll find similar properties of attraction or repulsion if working with some of these other materials, wool and wax, silk and glass, and also this material amber, which is fossilized tree sap, and which was considered for many millennia in a lot of different civilizations as a gemstone. And in many of those civilizations, they had observed the same properties, these static-like properties of particularly amber picking up dust and fibers. And that takes me to ancient Greece. So this is delving into a story of Greek mythology, and very often mythology and science are seen as polar opposites, but they do have similarities in that they're both, the aim of both of them was very often to explain the shape of the world around you. And this story in Greek mythology starts with their sun god, Helios. Now, he had a daily job to do, and his job was to ride the sun chariot across the sky from dawn to dusk. And he did it very well. He never missed a day. This is just a depiction of that here. Now, Helios had children. He had a son named Phaeton, and this is Phaeton here. Phaeton's name is synonymous with photon, which is the modern term for a particle of light, which makes sense as he was a child of the sun. And he had some sisters. I don't actually know their names. but they were collectively referred to as the Heliades, which is literally translates as the daughters of children of the sun. Now, according to different stories, there are either 3 or 5 or 7 of these. In this painting here, they're the 4 naked ladies who look like they're sprouting leaves from their heads and their hands. And that comes into play in this story. Also, the reason that Phaeton looks very distressed is that that's generally how he's depicted in this story. And this is the only real story I've found about him in Greek mythology. So you may relate to this story if you have teenagers, particularly at the moment, and they're housebound or they can't go very far and they're begging you to take the car out for a drive or the tractor out for a drive. And they're probably promising you that they'll just go to the end of the estate or the end of the road and they'll be really careful, nobody will see them, and they'll come straight back. Well, Phaeton did the same thing. He begged his dad, Helios, to drive the sun chariot for a day. And it was because he had boasted to his mates that he was going to do it. So eventually Helios he agreed because he felt guilty. He wasn't a particularly good father, and he felt guilty at this point, and it meant he got a day off, which was unheard of. So Phaeton took the sun chariot out, and it didn't go very well. So this is a depiction of what happened on that journey, and it's pretty difficult to work out what's going on here, but I'm pretty sure that this guy here is Phaeton. So what he did was he literally took the sun chariot out, and he did want to go and show his mates that he was riding the sun chariot. Now, his friends were holidaying in north of Africa at the time. So he rode the sun chariot too close to Africa, and he burned the lands. And this is the Greek version of how the deserts in Africa were created and how the people from there came to have burnt skin. And then he overcorrected, and as he traveled over the north, he pulled too far away from the lands, and he created the frozen wastelands of the north. So anyway, the gods, the other Greek gods, saw this happening. They started to complain to Zeus. Zeus was most of the time either fighting, drinking, or fornicating, so he wasn't very happy to be disturbed. So he just took Phaeton out with a lightning bolt, and Phaeton fell to his death and fell into a river where we saw his sisters, the Heliades, crying. And their grief was so intense, the gods felt sorry for them, and the gods turned them into poplar trees, the first poplar trees in the world, and their tears ran as sap and turned to amber. So these are the tears of the children of the sun. So when our Irish physicist, George Stoney, was looking for a name for his most remarkable fundamental unit of electricity, after some deliberation, he landed on the Greek word for the tears of the children of the sun, which is electron, which means amber in Greek. And that led us to, later in Latin, the term electricus, which meant of amber, and it referred to any material that displayed the same static electric properties as amber. And that is the end of that story.